Okay. So once again, good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us to our session of the Day After the War Forum. This forum was created just a week after the horrific October 7th events, in order for us to have an opportunity to think and work together on our opportunities for the day after the war. And the thought is that we have to think about this now, for it should and would shape how the war is being conducted. And so in past events, we discussed such issues as international conflicts, what can we learn from them from a general perspective point of view, the legal aspects of the day after the war, the standing of nearing Arab countries, what are their stakes at the conflict. And tonight we are with Professor James Kar-Llindsey. He's an Englishman from Kent and LSE universities at the UK, but he's actually also a neighbor of us, currently in Cyprus. It's a nearing country, and he's an expert for wars and conflicts and peacemaking in general, but specifically in the Balkan countries. And so the thought was that for us to hear from Professor Kar-Llindsey on the causes of the Kosovo War in 1999 and its aftermath, the way it was handled by the NATO forces, the UN special mission, and especially what can we, if anything, take from that to our opportunities for the day after in our area. The thought was that that could really contribute our understanding of the issue. And so I was very happy that Professor Kar-Llindsey was really forthcoming with the invitation, and he's here with us tonight, so I won't waste any more of our time, and I'll hand the floor to you. So please.
Right, thank you so very much for the invitation. It was incredibly kind of you to drop me a line and sort of say, look, you've got this initiative, which I think is absolutely fantastic. I mean, as somebody who's worked on conflict for many, many decades, so although I have an academic hat, I very much have a practice hat as well, having worked on various initiatives ranging from, what we call track 1.5, which, as many of you are aware, are sort of semi-official type of processes, through even to sort of formal peace processes. So, for example, in 2017, I was involved in the UN Cyprus talks. So as somebody who's sort of worked on conflict from a very practical perspective for many decades, it's wonderful to see that in these difficult days that there is some thinking going on about what happens next, because I think that this is really one of the great worries that many observers have about what we're seeing at the moment, that rushing in, and for very understandable reasons, but not thinking about, well, what's going to happen. And I think, there's a sense that, where is this going to go? What's going to be the end result of this? And so when you reached out to me and sort of said, look, are there any particular insights we can draw from the Western Balkans, and suggested Kosovo, I thought it was an absolutely excellent idea, because I think Kosovo does offer up a lot of very, very valuable insights that can be sort of help to identify good and bad elements that need to be thought of in any sort of attempt to move forward at the end of what we're seeing at the moment. I think, of course, we have to be a little bit careful when we draw the parallels, both from a theoretical and a practical perspective. I think it's important to mention that from an international legal standpoint, Kosovo is rather different than the question of what happens with Israel-Palestine. As you'll all be aware, I mean, under international law, Kosovo is actually seen as a question of secession, whereas Israel-Palestine is considered, broadly speaking, to be a question of decolonization or thwarted decolonization or decolonization that was never fully realized. Now, I understand that that will be a controversial perspective for some of the audience, for some of the people watching this who take issue with that, and I understand. But what I'm trying to say is just simply from a purely legalistic standpoint from international law, a clear difference would be drawn, and I'll try and tease out a little bit of that. But I don't want to make that the central point of what I'm talking about tonight, because I don't think it's quite as important as some of the other elements that perhaps we can discuss that came up in some of the excellent questions that were asked. So look, rather than give you the full history of the background to Kosovo, what I'll try and do is just skirt over it to give you a broad sense of some of the issues. And if anyone then wants to pick up in it on the questions and answers, I'll be absolutely delighted to do so. But it might just be helpful to put it in a bit of context. So, I mean, you know, as with all of these conflicts that one deals with, you know, history plays an enormous part. Now, I'm not a great believer that history should be the be-all and end-all of understanding conflict, because I think so many of the conflicts that we deal with today are actually rooted in our understanding of international law, our understanding of contemporary international politics. But obviously, history does come in, and contesting claims to pieces of territory. And that's exactly the same we have in the case of Kosovo and Serbia. So, you know, you'll have contrasting views. So the Albanians will say, we are one of the original peoples of the Balkan Peninsula, whereas the Slavs, the Serbs, came in later. That's as may be. But what we do know is that in medieval times, the area that comprises Kosovo was considered by Serbia to be a heartland, if you like, of the medieval Serbian kingdom. And there are some important Serbian religious sites there. There are some significant monasteries, for example, and churches that exist in Kosovo. So you'll very often have Serbs say that for them, Kosovo represents, if you like, an integral part of the cultural, the historical Serbian territory, which gives it a very special place in their hearts. Now, I always treat that with a little bit of caution. Yes, it does have some important religious sites, but if you were to ask most people in Serbia, have they ever been to Kosovo? The vast majority would say no. And I think that very often this is something that, you know, you'll hear the slogan, Kosovo is Serbia, Kosovo is Serbia. But in reality, it's almost more performative than anything else for all sorts of reasons that we can discuss. But I think it is important, nevertheless, to recognize that certainly for a proportion of the Serbian population, it has a resonance, a religious, a historical, a cultural significance, which needs to be taken on board. However, we get to the 14th, 15th century, it's conquered by the Ottoman Empire, and it remains under Ottoman Turkish rule for the centuries that follow. And what we then get to is the start of the 20th century. The Ottoman Empire is weakening, and essentially we have the Balkan Wars. Serbia reclaims Kosovo as part of the Serbian state, which had by that point emerged as an independent entity unto itself. But crucially, even by that point, the demographic figures show that the majority of those living in Kosovo are Albanian, ethnic Albanian. Now, the Albanians would say they always had a presence there, and yes, indeed, you know, from what we can tell from historical records, they did. But regardless, the key point to make is that certainly by the start of the 20th century, when Serbia took control of it, it was predominantly Albanian. Now, you can quibble over the exact numbers and proportions, but I think that is an accepted fact. So the next stopping point is we get to the end of the First World War, and Serbia with Kosovo is then integrated into what then became the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, which in 1929 became the Kingdom of Yugoslavia. The next point is end of 1945, end of the Second World War. The Kingdom of Yugoslavia no longer exists. Instead, you have communist Yugoslavia, the People's Federal Republic or People's Republic of Yugoslavia. And that creates a different dynamic within Yugoslavia, because essentially Yugoslavia is a very mixed entity. So predominantly, as the name would suggest, it's made up of the South Slavs. I mean, Yugoslavia actually that's essentially what it translates to, South Slavs. And you have what's called the nations and the nationalities of Yugoslavia. And the nations are the 6 peoples within Yugoslavia who are considered to be indigenous Yugoslav peoples, South Slav peoples. So working away from the north to the south, you have the Slovenes, you have the Croats, you have the Serbs. Bosnia is a bit of an interesting entity because it's made up of Serbs, Croats, and Bosnian Muslims that we now call Bosniaks. And then you have Montenegro and you have Macedonia. And each of these broadly corresponds to one of the 6 nations of Yugoslavia, one of the 6 South Slav nations that make up Yugoslavia. But on top of that, you have a whole range of different, what we call nationalities, or what were called by Tito and the Yugoslav authorities as nationalities. And these are various groups who stand apart from the indigenous nations. So the nations have their own republics. The nationalities would include Italians, Hungarians, Romanians, Bulgarians, crucially for our story, Albanians, but also would include several transnational peoples who don't have a separate homeland outside of the borders of Yugoslavia. So that, for example, would include Roma. It would include Ruthenians. So Ruthenia was a territory that had sort of existed within Ukraine. And of course, you know, not forgetting that Yugoslavia also had a Jewish population who were one of the nationalities of Yugoslavia. So essentially the difference between a nation and nationality really came to the fore in 1974 when a new constitution was created. So you had these 6 republics, which nominally gave the nations a right of secession, but it didn't grant that to the nationalities. But you had a bit of a strange structure emerge because you had the 6 republics that corresponded to the nations. But then within Serbia, you had 2 autonomous areas. So up in the north, you had an area called Vojvodina, which is very mixed, probably one of the most mixed areas in Europe. I think it's got potentially 27 different groups that have been identified as living there. And that ranged across, all sorts. But essentially, it was predominantly Serbian. But the second of these autonomous areas within Serbia was Kosovo, which was predominantly Albanian. But it comes back to this point. So Kosovo essentially existed almost as a separate republic within Yugoslavia. It sat on the Federal Council, but because it was inhabited by Albanians and because Yugoslavia said that the Albanians have their own homeland in neighboring Albania, they weren't entitled to become a republic. And of course, this would become hugely significant when Yugoslavia began to break apart. So we had Marshal Tito, which ruled the country until he died in 1980, and then the country began its slow process of breaking apart, which really took off in 1991. And this became significant because the question then emerged about who had the right to break away. And essentially the wars in Yugoslavia centered on one key question: was it the republics or was it the nations that had a right of self-determination? And Serbia argued that it was the nations, hence all the Serbs living beyond the boundaries, the borders of the Serbian Republic should have the right also for self-determination. In other words, the right to join Serbia if that's what they wanted. So that would have included the Serbs living in Croatia and essentially the Serbs living in Bosnia. Then the other republics, of course, took a very different position under international law and said, no, it applies to the republics. And yes, the republics broadly map on to these nations, but not exactly. But nevertheless, Serbs living in Croatia will just have to accept that they're in Croatia. Serbs living in Bosnia will have to accept that they're living in Bosnia. It gets a little bit more complex because Croatia was then arguing that Croats living in Bosnia should then have the right to join. There wasn't always a lot of consistency in this, but the point emerges that you had this big debate that led essentially to the wars that we saw in Yugoslavia. But the European Union put together a commission that decided on this issue and ruled that essentially, under a principle of a long-standing principle in international law, for anyone who studies international law and is aware of this, something called uti possidetis, which broadly translates as you possess. And this was the criteria by which we determined the borders, for example, in Africa and Asia during the period of decolonization, rather than open up the question of were those borders legitimate in terms of different peoples. It was just taken as given that the colonial borders that have been drawn up, as irregular as they may have been, as divisive as they may have been, it just made a lot more sense to just say they were drawn up, they exist as colonial boundaries. When these territories become independent, those boundaries will remain intact. And in actual fact, it's a testament. I mean, if you consider there have been remarkably few territorial wars in Africa, partly because of this principle. And so this principle was essentially also then applied to Yugoslavia. Crucially, it was essentially also applied to the Soviet Union when that broke apart. The rule was that the 15 top-level republics of the Soviet Union, so you had the 3 Baltic republics, obviously Ukraine, Russian Federation, Belarus, the 3 Caucasus republics, the 5 Central Asia, Moldova, those became the borders of the newly independent states, whereas territories like, for example, Transnistria or Abkhazia or South Ossetia or Nagorno-Karabakh, which was second order, weren't given a right of independence or a right of self-determination. So essentially what happened is we get to 1995, and the 6 republics have essentially become independent. It's not quite the case with Serbia and Montenegro. They remain in a union until about 10 years later. But of course, Kosovo have been told, you don't have this right to become independent. You're just going to have to accept that you're part of Serbia. And the Kosovo Albanians were obviously deeply aggrieved by this, saying, look, this is unfair. We should have a right of independence. The vagaries of the constitution mean that we were denied the right of a nation, but it seems incongruous. But the international community at that point had decided, well, no, it's just going to be easier for Kosovo to remain within Serbia, albeit under some sort of agreed autonomy. And the Kosovo Albanians were deeply unhappy about this, so launched an armed uprising against Serbian rule. And what we saw over the following years is that Serbia became increasingly aggressive in how it tackled that uprising, and more indiscriminate. And so by 1998, we were getting to a stage where the international community was becoming fed up again and simply said, look, we're going to need an agreement on this. And so peace talks were held in 1999. Now, there'll be all sorts of arguments about why they broke down. Some would argue that it was Serbian intransigence. Others would say, look, they were handled badly by the West that made demands on Serbia, for example, to allow NATO troops into the sovereign territory of Yugoslavia or Serbia, that would never have been accepted by Belgrade. I mean, we can debate it endlessly, but we essentially got to a point where those talks broke down, and with no end in sight for the violence, NATO then decided to intervene, and it did so without UN Security Council authorization. And again, there's a very important debate that takes place about the legitimacy versus the legality of that. And, you hear the argument that it was illegal, but it was legitimate. And I think there was probably, quite a lot to be said for that by the letter of international law, this wasn't sanctified by the UN Security Council. So you could argue that it was an illegal act of aggression, but I think a lot of people would say, given the circumstances, there was a certain legitimacy. Anyway, look, we get to the stage where there was 78 days of NATO bombing, and then Serbia eventually capitulates. And at that point, the UN steps in. So NATO remained on the ground as the chief provider of security. So unlike other places, it wasn't a UN peacekeeping force that was put in place. NATO to this day remains the chief guarantor of the security of Kosovo. And interestingly, even though we have this interesting debate that a number of NATO members don't actually recognize Kosovo, they have served in KFOR, which is the Kosovo force, the NATO force there. So regardless of countries' positions on the status of Kosovo, even now, many will understand the need to have a NATO force there and to be guaranteeing the security situation, not just vis-a-vis Serbia, which Serbia, jumping ahead a little, has actually disavowed the use of force to retake Kosovo. It said that it'll fight a diplomatic and legal battle, but not a military one. But there's also that force has to remain in place in order to protect the Serbian population in Kosovo. But I'm jumping ahead a little, so I'll come back to it in a minute. But essentially what you then had is this force is put in place, and you have a major state-building exercise under Resolution 1244, which is establishing the United Nations mission in Kosovo, UNMIK. And this essentially becomes the government of Kosovo. Now, under Resolution 1244, officially Kosovo remained under Yugoslav sovereignty. And importantly to note that 1244 is very unusual in UN Security Council resolutions, in that it's a resolution that was put in place in perpetuity. So it, unlike most peacekeeping missions or state-building missions, where the mandate has to be renewed, usually on a 6 or 12-month basis, Resolution 1244 remains in place until it's rescinded or superseded. So UNMIK still actually exists, even though it's essentially completely obsolete now. But anyway, this mission is put in place to set up an administration for Kosovo. And the decision is taken that there won't be a decision taken on status at the moment. You know, Kosovo is officially under Serbian sovereignty, but the reality is that you couldn't reintroduce Serbian sovereignty. So very soon after that, what you're now starting to see is the Albanian population is saying, well, look, we've got rid of the Serbs, but we haven't got the independence that we wanted. And so they started to put pressure for this. And this started to put the UN, the international community, in a very difficult position because, yes, Serbia was no longer administering Kosovo, but it remained under Serbian authority. And the international community couldn't just simply take it away from Serbia. I mean, this went against all the principles of international law, territorial integrity of states and things. But so what they started to do is say, right, okay, the way we're going to handle this is before we get onto the status talks, let's think about making Kosovo a democratic society. Let's talk about rule of law, human rights. So they introduced a policy called Standards Before Status, which essentially put in place a principle that let's concentrate on making Kosovo a democratic, functioning society before we then get on to the debate about what exactly we're going to do with it. And, you know, I think we can be very critical of UNMIK in different ways and things like that. But this seemed to be, you know, the idea of trying to, as I say, put off that discussion until 2004, when there was some major interethnic rioting that took place. And this led to a lot of attacks on Serbs, ethnic Serbs still living in Kosovo. So after UNMIK took over, I mean, there was a lot of score settling. So whereas Serbian authorities had been cracking down on Albanians, once the Serbian authorities were out, once the Serbian paramilitaries, the military were out, a lot of that anger from the Albanian community turned onto the Serbs. So hence KFOR then became a peacekeeping force to protect the Serbs. But in 2004, we saw this rioting, which really did start to open up the question of what was going to happen to Kosovo. And it was at that stage that the decision was taken that, look, we can't realistically keep Kosovo in limbo. And it would have presented a very, very difficult position for international peacekeepers. And I'm sure, people listening will be picking out certain things which they'll be thinking, yeah, this sounds very familiar, or this is something that will need to be thought about. And I think this next point is one that I would certainly flag as a key point, is that they got to this stage of where UN and NATO had gone in. And I remember being told this by senior international officials, Western officials, had gone in to protect the Kosovo Albanians, but their desire for independence was getting to a stage where there was a very distinct danger that if status talks didn't begin, let alone end in independence, which is what they wanted, then that anger could have been turned on UN peacekeepers and NATO peacekeepers. And then you would have been left with a disastrous situation that just 5 or 6 years after NATO intervened to help the Kosovo Albanians, the West would have had to explain why those people that they'd been sent in to help had now turned on them. And it was at that point that essentially the West said, look, we can't possibly consider giving Kosovo back to Serbia. We've got to do something about it. So what do we do? Well, the only realistic alternative is to give the Kosovo Albanians what they wanted, which was independence. How can we justify that? Well, what we'll do is we'll recast it as a unique case that will say that, look, by virtue of its status in Yugoslavia, by virtue of the human rights abuses that had taken place by Serbia, and by virtue of the prolonged period of UN administration, this meant that what we saw in Kosovo stood apart from other cases around the world. Now, I mean, of course, for those who do international law or any sort of law, you'll know how uncomfortable the idea of a unique case is. It just doesn't sit well with how we understand how law should be applied. Saying, right, okay, because something doesn't fit our model, we'll just call it a special case. And I think what became particularly problematic was that a UN process was started under Martti Ahtisaari, the former president of Finland, who recently died, who'd had some success dealing with conflicts elsewhere. For example, Aceh, he'd been involved with Northern Ireland. But Ahtisaari essentially took the decision right from day one that the only outcome of this could be independence, even though this would have gone against established principles of international law. But this idea, well, we'll call it a unique case. And he essentially decided from day one this was going to be the outcome. So these status talks, which were meant to be open without a prejudged outcome, ended up going in that direction. And he eventually presented a blueprint for an independent Kosovo. And this, of course, was rejected by Serbia. So the Serbs had said, whereas the Albanians had said, look, we only want independence. The Serbs said, we'll give you anything but independence, and sort of had talked about extensive autonomy and things like that. And Ahtisaari had essentially come down and said, only independence. And hadn't really explored any other opportunities for this. And, I'd spoken to figures. I wrote a book on the process who said that he made a big mistake in how he handled it. And I have to say, I completely agree. I interviewed him a couple of times when writing the book. And I at one point said to him, look, didn't you consider giving the Serbs a face-saving way out? And he just replied to me, well, they didn't deserve it. Okay, well, thank you. You condemned everyone in the Balkans to this mess because you didn't actually sort of say, well, look, is there a way out? And people sort of like, okay, smart ass, then what would have been the way out? And I actually have always believed that South Sudan presented a very good model that we could have implemented for Kosovo, which essentially, for anyone who might not be aware of what happened in South Sudan, very similar case. South Sudan was considered part of Sudan, but it was ethnically very different from Northern Sudan, whereas obviously sort of main part of Sudan is essentially Arab. If you go to South Sudan, it's sub-Saharan African, it's animist and Christian in makeup, very uncomfortable coming together, very similar in many ways to Serbia and Kosovo. And essentially what they eventually agreed on was a peace deal that left South Sudan under Sudanese sovereignty, but gave it a high degree of autonomy, and essentially said after 6 years of autonomy, they would get to decide on whether they wanted to retain that autonomy. If they didn't want to retain the autonomy, then they would become independent. So essentially it became a face-saving way out for all sides, and essentially said to Sudan, you've got 6 years now to prove to the South Sudanese that you want to really treat them well, that, you know, I use this phrase, love bomb them, to say, look, we really want you to be part of us. We all, I think, knew exactly what South Sudan was going to do, and notwithstanding the mess that it's now become, very sadly, you know, that was an interesting model. And there was even a time when the Serbian president had said, maybe we could consider a transitional phase where Kosovo remains under Serbian sovereignty for another 10 to 15 years, but essentially has a massive degree of autonomy leading to a referendum. And I always felt that that would have been a good option, essentially giving Kosovo independence in all but name. So it would have had all those elements of statehood, but technically it would have remained part of Serbia. But even then, it would have been a very light touch. You know, you could have even given it most of its symbols, you know, its own flag, its own anthem, but just simply said, the problem that we got to, I think, and, you know, is that I think you find in these situations that people fixate on the word independence rather than the concept independence. And I think this was a really good example of it, because I think by that point, there was no persuading the Kosovo Albanians to take a massive degree of autonomy, just short of independence. They were fixated on the idea of the word independence, being able to call themselves independent, even though it was going to create a lot of problems on the international stage. So I think this became a real stumbling block. And I've often said, I think Western officials did not do enough to try and say, look, to Kosovo, this is a complex legal situation that we're faced with. We're going to help you, and eventually it's going to lead to independence, but you're going to need to be a bit patient for a bit longer. But they could see the way that violence was building up, and so decided, you know what, it'll just be easier to cut and run and say this is a special case and allow Kosovo to declare independence and then deal with the consequences of that. So just before that happened, Ahtisaari had presented his plan for independence. It had failed. Russia had blocked it in the Security Council. And there was another process that was put together that was called the Troika. And I think this is interesting for another reason you'll see in a minute. And this was made up of an American official, a European official, and a Russian official. So it was essentially there to, you know, the Americans supported the Kosovo Albanians, the Russians supported the Serbs, and then the EU would sort of be between the two, although most of the major countries were probably more predisposed to the Kosovo Albanians. But the EU official on that was a very senior German official, Wolfgang Ischinger. Many might know from Munich Security Conference that, you know, he went on and ran that. He'd been the German ambassador in London, very senior German diplomat. And he, I think, did something that was very interesting, because many in Serbia were calling for autonomy. They were saying, no, Kosovo is Serbia, we'll give them massive autonomy, but they must remain part of Serbia. And he recast that discussion, and he said to them, look, it's all very well you saying that you want Kosovo to remain part of Serbia, but what does that mean in real terms? What is the price that you're willing to pay? Because you can't just say, oh, Kosovo, you're part of Serbia, but you'll have absolutely no decision-making powers. You'll just sit in your corner. You can make some of your own local autonomy, but you can't have any say over central government. You know, so if Serbia has its foreign policy that Kosovo doesn't have as an autonomous area, you know, how's Kosovo going to be involved in that? And he said to Serbia, would you really be willing, for example, to have a Kosovo Albanian vice president? Would you be really willing to have Kosovo Albanians sitting round the cabinet table? Would you be willing to have a third of all your MPs in the national parliament as Kosovo Albanians? Would you be willing to have generals in your army as Kosovo Albanians? Would you be willing to have diplomats, ambassadors, Kosovo Albanians? And the reality is that most Serbs wouldn't. It just wasn't. And it comes down to this thing of, and we talk about this a lot in conflict, that it was more about the territory than anything else. And they wanted Kosovo. They just didn't want the Kosovo Albanians. And I think, we have to be very honest about this. And I can point the fingers at what the Albanians have done as well. And as I said, I think their fixation on the word independence rather than the concept, and Serbia's fixation on the idea of holding on to territory but not wanting the people that lived there, meant that neither side could really come up with the compromises that I think might have allowed a process that sort of said eventually Kosovo will become independent, but we'll create a way that allows Serbia to get there. Anyway, look, these opportunities were missed. Kosovo declared independence in 2008, and we were left with a mess. Because you had certain Western countries, so you had the United States, you had Britain, you had Germany, you had France, Italy, all recognizing Kosovo's independence, and then half the world saying we won't, including Russia and China and 5 EU members. So even now, 5 EU members don't recognize Kosovo, and that's, of course, you've got Spain, you've got Slovakia, you've got Romania, you've got Greece, and you've got Cyprus. And so this big battle then emerged over recognition. I'm not going to go into so much of this because I think this is where, in many ways, the cases of what happens to a Palestinian state is a bit different from Kosovo because, as I say, I think they're treated a little bit differently. But I think what was interesting is that there was a case taken before the International Court of Justice on the legality of Kosovo's declaration of independence. And the court essentially took the position that it called it, essentially, it sidestepped the issue. It didn't say that Kosovo's declaration of independence had led to a state. It simply said that there was nothing in international law that prohibited a declaration of independence unless there was a prohibition, such as a Security Council resolution. So Kosovo could say, well, our declaration of independence was legal, and Serbia could say, well, but the court didn't say that you're a country now, you're not a state. It sidestepped that issue. And then what we saw is the EU stepped in to say, right, okay, what can we do to normalize relations between Kosovo and Serbia, leading to, several agreements that looked like relations were starting to improve. You started to have the gradual integration of Serbs in, for example, the police force into Kosovo. There was also talk of setting up a new municipality, an association of Serbian municipalities, which would give a certain degree of autonomy for the Serbian communities living in Kosovo, which in fact, actually, you've got two distinct communities. You've got those living in the south of Kosovo, which are fairly small and separated into a bit of a patchwork. And then you've got 4 municipalities north of the Ibar. So it's sort of about 10% of Kosovo's population in territory in the north is predominantly Serbian. And there have been discussions about how to deal with them. Do you give them autonomy? One idea that has been talked about is a territorial redrawing of the boundaries. Very controversial. Many people have opposed it. Look, I don't hide the fact that I've always thought that this is a sensible and logical solution, especially balanced against Albanian communities living in parts of southern Serbia. Have to be clear, this is not ethnic cleansing. This is not repatriation. It's simply redrawing the boundaries as sovereign states have the right to do so. That would essentially mean no one is told that they have to move out of their houses. Essentially, in the north of Kosovo, they go to bed living nominally under a Kosovo, state of Kosovo, but effectively under Serbian control, and wake up next morning not only effectively under Serbian control, but under a sovereign Serb state, and the same. So it's not quite as drastic. We're not talking about a 1924 population exchange that we saw between Greece and Turkey. But that, as I say, has been rejected. And we're now at a stage where actually relations have deteriorated in recent years. You have, for all sorts of reasons, you have the sides look like they were starting to get to an agreement around 2018, again involving some sort of territorial redrawing. This was killed off. Britain and Germany were steadfastly opposed to it, even though many other countries had started to accept that this might be the most logical way that would actually allow Serbia to sign off Kosovo's independence, because that's essentially all it needs. It just needs Serbia to say, we accept an independent Kosovo, and then Kosovo will join the UN. Well, unless Russia now wants to, but maybe we can talk about that. I'm drawing to an end in a second, I promise. So we're now in a stage where things are starting to get very tense again. There was a very serious incident recently, which led to shootings of Kosovo Albanian police who had tried to assert Kosovo's sovereignty in the north, despite the fact that they were warned, please don't do this. It's a very delicate situation. An arms cache was discovered. We still don't quite know who's behind it. There's allegations that the Serbian government was behind it. But the trouble is, maybe there were elements within the security forces that had been supplying arms. There's not much reason to think that the Serbian government itself would have wanted to do this. It's so damaging to their reputation and to relations with the European Union if it emerges that they were actually supporting a terrorist organization in northern Kosovo. So look, speculation is going on. There's an investigation. We don't exactly know. But what we can say is that tensions are getting arising again. So Kosovo's becoming a potential flashpoint, and many think that in light of what we've seen in Ukraine, obviously there's theories going around that has, Russia been trying to foment problems elsewhere. And, you have these theories that maybe this is also what's laid a little bit behind, the Hamas attack, and there are fears that this, the Balkans could be another front. I think we need to be a little bit careful about these ideas, but we have to acknowledge that it's going around, and we have to also acknowledge that hybrid warfare is an important technique in modern international relations. But look, before I sort of finish up this part and sort of maybe address some of the questions, I think one of the things that I often say is in territorial disputes, we often say, yes, a country or a peoples want territory, or they don't want to give up a piece of territory. And we sort of take it for granted, but we don't really ask the question, why don't they want to give it up? And I often say, I think it's so important. We need to do more of understanding it. And I think we can argue that there's about 7 different distinct reasons that why peoples don't want to give, or states don't want to give up territory. And I mean, the first one applies in almost all cases, which is as an emotional attachment. And this is a bit different from cultural. I'll talk about that in a minute. An emotional that, I often say to people, close your eyes, and there are some countries where this actually produces some interesting results. Close your eyes and imagine what your country looks like. All of us can do it. We've all got a mental map in our heads of what we think our country looks like. And if that border changes, especially substantially, it produces a reaction. It just doesn't feel right. So it's almost like an emotional thing, which is often reinforced in people's minds. So even now, I mean, in Serbia, they will do a weather forecast for Kosovo, and they will show the map of Serbia showing Kosovo, because that is how they're teaching people that this is the map of Serbia. I mean, it gets all really interesting because there's obviously lots of Serbs who remember Yugoslavia. So they've already had that messed around with, and then it was Serbia and Montenegro in a union that Montenegro then left. But I think that that's an important thing, that, we have a certain emotional attachment. I think the second factor, of course, to consider is a religious or a cultural attachment, and thinking about how that functions. In some cases, this doesn't mean very much. In other cases, it can be incredibly important. And I'm not necessarily going to prejudge, how people in Israel view Palestine and the broader, the broader areas. That's for you all to sort of in your own minds be thinking about. But what I'll say in the case of Kosovo is that is a powerful thing because of these churches, because of the religious element. For many Serbs, this does have an important place, although, as I said at the start, it's a little bit overplayed. I often think, I mean, that's not, before Serbs get really unhappy and start shouting at me and writing me abusive emails and things like that. It's not to say it's unimportant. The religious sites in any final settlement of Kosovo are going to have to be taken into account. And one of the things actually which has stirred Serbian anger and given a new impetus to Serbia's efforts to prevent the recognition of Kosovo internationally is because Kosovo applied to join UNESCO. And many people in Serbia said, this is just absolutely unacceptable. These churches are Serbian Orthodox heritage, not Kosovo's heritage. And they draw a very clear difference. And I think this is something that's going to need to be dealt with in whatever agreement is reached. The religious sites, whether they have some sort of special, religious status, autonomy, there's things, but it is important. So the second is a religious, cultural, historical significance. The third is economic. What value does territory have economically? And this can work both ways. Sometimes it can be a great economic powerhouse. So, for example, Spain doesn't want to lose Catalonia because it's wealthy. In the case of Kosovo, it was always incredibly poor. Kosovo was one of the most impoverished parts of Yugoslavia. It's an economic drag on Serbia, so it can work both ways. The fourth area is strategic significance. What significance does a piece of territory have for the security of the state overall? And the example I'll often give is if you consider South Ossetia for Georgia, if you look at a map of Georgia and you see, if you take out South Ossetia, if you've got large Russian presence there, it then gives Russia a spearhead to push down and divide Georgia into two, for example. So, sometimes territory can have a very important strategic significance for a state, for its own defense, that needs to be considered. So I believe that was 4. So fifth is a snowball effect. If you let one piece of territory go, are you then opening the way for another piece of the territory to break away? Again, Spain is a really good example. If it lets Catalonia go, then the Basque region will ask for independence. And then once that happens, could you start to see other parts, Galicia, for example, of asking for independence? I'm just checking my notes, see if there was any. Oh, all right. So that's the snowball effect. Refugees is another factor. So in some countries, a refugee population from the territory says, we've got to get this back. So here in Cyprus, refugees have traditionally, or internally displaced persons, as they officially are, but colloquially refugees, are an important bloc. Whereas in Serbia, funnily enough, refugees from Kosovo, marginalized, very, very little say, they're pushed to the edges of society. Same with refugees or, who came from Bosnia. So it's not always the case everywhere. And then I think the final element to consider, and this is where I'll wrap up for this bit, is to say that very often the way that territory is lost is also highly significant in how countries, peoples will respond to it. So I often think that for Serbs, it's not that Kosovo matters as much as they'll make out. It's the way that it was taken from them, because they know that they call it a unique case, but they know that this is essentially the only time since 1945. Bangladesh, you could also argue with East and West Pakistan. It's an interesting case. I won't go into it now. But Kosovo is effectively the only time that a territory has had land taken from it as a result of a conflict, a secessionist dispute, which has allowed a people to then become independent. So it's highly, for the Serbs, I think it's very neuralgic. It touches a nerve that I think, had it been a properly negotiated process, you could have allowed most Serbs to part with it. And I often draw the example. I mean, people in Britain sort of say, oh, you know what, the Serbs should just get over it, and accept the loss and things. Yeah. What would have happened if Argentina had won in the Falklands? We'd still be going on about it nonstop, about how we had it stolen from us, and Or if at the height of the Troubles in the 1970s, the UN had appointed a commission that recommended that Northern Ireland should be united with Ireland, we would still, the headlines in the newspapers would still be going on about it 50 years later. You absolutely guarantee it. So, I think we need to be a little bit careful of taking into account how these psychological elements can often play a part, that people feel powerless or feel humiliated in the way that they lost territory can often affect, it becomes even more powerful than the loss of the territory itself, if you see what I mean, or the value of that territory in their minds. So I think I'll leave it there for just giving an overall presentation. I hope that it's given some sort of ideas, and obviously throw open the discussion. Ronnie, you sent me some questions this morning. I don't know if you want to sort of maybe ask those yourself, or whether you'd like me to refer to some of them, maybe pick out some of the ones that you think could be valuable.
So first of all, thank you very much for this really interesting presentation. It was very intense. I knew I couldn't stop you in the middle because you're so enthusiastic about it. But and again and again you said it's a question of whether it is a unique case. And I think for us it's very important, because we often think that Israel-Palestine is a unique case. And so we should get accustomed to the fact that it is also argued by others that they are a unique case. So I won't go into my questions about your presentation, just because I want us to have enough time to talk about your thoughts about the lessons that can be learned for our conflict. So let's start with the question of the religious component. To what extent do you think that the religious has played a role in the Kosovo affair, and to what extent that may affect the lessons that can be learned for our case?
I'd be very cautious on the religious element in one way, but it's very significant in another. And I think I've touched on this, is that so Serbs almost uniformly are Christian Orthodox, and Albanians are very largely nominally Muslim. It's often said, Albanians would say the real religion of Albanians is being Albanian rather than Muslim, but many are nominally Muslim. Some are practicing. There are Christian Albanians as well. So I think it sort of gets overlaid a bit in the debate, but I've never felt that it's as significant. It's a bit like Cyprus as well. It becomes significant for some quarters, but I wouldn't necessarily class it as a religious conflict as such. I think it's an ethnic conflict, but not a religious one. But the religion does matter because of the churches in Kosovo. That's what gives it significance. That for the Serbian Orthodox Church, these are important. For religious Serbs, these are important sites. But there are ways of dealing with it. And I think, even the churches themselves can recognize that although ideally they would prefer to be part of Serbia, they are probably more open to the idea of something that will allow them to be preserved and protected, even if that means having to live within a Kosovo state. It might not be what they want, but they can see a way that you can do this. And I think that that's incredibly significant in this debate. So I wouldn't cast it as a religious discussion. I think, we need to be very careful about doing so. But there is an important religious factor that does come into it, as I say, in terms of these churches.
So another question is, so how did Kosovo overcome, if at all, the arrangements after the war in terms of the UNMIK control? So how was the transition possible?
So it was a very interesting case. So when Kosovo declared independence, they firmly reject the claim that it's a unilateral declaration of independence. They use the term coordinated declaration of independence, that they coordinated this with Britain, with Germany, with France, with the United States. Now, of course, anyone who does international law knows that coordinated declaration of independence is meaningless. It doesn't mean a unilateral declaration of independence is understood as pejorative, but essentially it just means one side declares independence. It's you can have cases where one side declares independence, the other one accepts it. South Sudan is a perfect example. The first country to recognize South Sudan's declaration of independence, its statehood, was Sudan. So it was completely uncontested. So a UDI is just simply where one side has done it, which is exactly what happened in Kosovo. And then there was a period of international oversight of that independence. So Marty Ahtisaari had drawn up a constitution which gave minorities a significant number of rights. Admittedly, there was a lot of rights that were put in place, even if we sort of say that it was very problematic, the actual nature of independence. So there was international oversight for a period, and then that melted away and left Kosovo essentially independent, but we see in all sorts of ways its room for maneuver was actually rather limited for quite a long time. And some would even argue today. So, for example, when it was talking about a land swap, which is something that a sovereign state should be perfectly free to do, that was stopped by outside countries, which is a fairly clear argument that, Kosovo isn't perhaps as sovereign. Sometimes countries, even those that recognize it, say it is, but that's another debate. But essentially, there was an oversight period. So you've still got UNMIK in place. It doesn't do anything anymore. You've still got KFOR in place. You had a period of international supervision, and then transferred over to the full authority of the institutions of Kosovo.
So the overall takeaway from the UNMIK is that it's a good experience to learn from. Is it something that today international bodies would agree to implement in Gaza, or is it a failed example that won't be repeated?
Look, I mean, I think it's incredibly interesting, because I think there's a mixed picture that obviously one can draw of it. I mean, I think it's important to say that, we had the heyday of big UN missions 20 years ago. I mean, there was a time, we got to the end of the Cold War, there was this sudden flourishing of UN peacekeeping. And, I often laugh that you can identify people, people who hold PhDs in international relations, when they did it by the subject they did. So my doctoral thesis was on the origins of the UN force in Cyprus. Peacekeeping, when I was doing my PhD, so that would have been around 1994, 95, was a huge subject in international relations. Everyone was doing their PhDs. I mean, you don't find anyone who does it now. I mean, it's completely passé. But it was that time when, we had all these missions, we had these big state building missions. Those have died away now. Where we do have big missions, for example, in the Sahel region, it's security focused. It's not state building. And I think the state building exercise came with very mixed outcome, and generally quite a poor outcome. So Kosovo, UNMIK was heavily criticized that it wasn't able to really bring about, a peaceful society which was fully democratic, and there were shortcomings there. You've got examples from East Timor, you've got examples from Haiti, for example. So it would mean reintroducing a major UN type of operation, which UN hasn't really been doing a lot of in recent years. And these are massive. I mean, you have to have security components. I think what becomes interesting in the Kosovo example, of course, to draw a difference, is that it wasn't the UN doing the security. It was NATO. So NATO, which is a powerful actor that would have deterred Serbia and Serbia lost Milosevic, and you actually had a democratic government. So as I say, Serbia disavowed the use of force to retake Kosovo. So I don't think that is an important element necessary in deterring Serbia, which has said it won't do it. But some would argue that if it wasn't there, Serbia might be tempted to have a pop. Maybe. But it also becomes important because it was then a more trusted element amongst the Kosovo Albanians. And, so when we're talking about Gaza, would we have to then find what would be some sort of security body which could fulfill both those factors? External facing security actor, which would then be respected by the people on the ground, but would also have that respect of the people on the ground because they would also see it as essentially protecting their interests. So what that would mean, I think, would have to be thought a little bit about, and what countries might be willing to do that and capable of doing it in a way that NATO could. I mean, NATO obviously is a serious outfit. I don't think NATO's going to have the credibility, and I don't think it would have the political will to get involved in doing something like that. So you'd need to be thinking, well, who could do it? But I think, UNRWA, there were a lot of shortcomings of it. People who looked at it would argue that there were a lot of failures. It was a massive mission, fortunes were spent, and for what? It didn't achieve the sort of outcomes. But I think this also highlights the problem that, you go into these situations and, again, the fixation is on an end outcome. And you can't keep those people in limbo. Once you put in a mission and say, this mission is, they will read it in a certain way. So if you create a mission that will go into Gaza, maybe West Bank, that will be read on the ground as leading in one direction and one direction only, which is to the consolidation and the formal creation of a Palestinian state. And you could try and put that off. You could try to do a standards before status procedure, but it's not going to tackle the fundamental frustration. So you're caught in a really difficult bind of wanting to use that time to democratize these societies, use it for reconstruction, rebuilding, put in place proper economic foundations for statehood, but you will also be battling against the peoples who believe that there's a time limit on this and want that mission to get out so they can have their full statehood. And that will, to my mind, that would be an incredibly important part to bear in mind, that, you can put in something like this, but don't think that it can be open-ended, because people will start to say, right, okay, we've got rid of Israel. Now we've got to get rid of this lot because we want our statehood. And I think that's a really, a message that, as we were talking about it a few days ago in preparation for this, I think, we touched on this subject, and more and more I've thought about it. I think, we have to be aware that these sorts of missions come with a time limit.
Right. I have two questions here that I would want us to refer to. First is of Ben here. It's a chat. He asks, how does the military outcome would affect the chances of the international coalition intervention to happen? Would it be fair to say that the international community would help only in the case of full demilitarization of Gaza Strip? Would you think that is something that is relevant for the international community's decision on what its role would be?
I mean, look, obviously there's complex dynamics that would come into play here. I think the danger is that, would you get into a situation that if there wasn't an Israeli withdrawal, then any mission that was put in the ground would then start to be seen as facilitating a continued presence? Now, that's not necessarily how it will see itself. That's not necessarily what it will be doing, but give it time and that's how it will be seen. And I think that then becomes a real problem for the peacekeepers who are trying to do this job. Now, of course, Israel would argue, well, it's all well and good, but we have to be sure that any mission that's put in on the ground is actually going to do the security job we need it to do. We need to make sure that, we're not going to have further attacks by Hamas or by any other group that may emerge. So can we trust this force to do a good job? So it comes back to the point that I made, that in the case of Kosovo, you were dealing with NATO. And even then, it's faced problems. We've seen recently there have been flare-ups of fighting. Several Hungarian peacekeepers were very severely injured in clashes with ethnic Serbs recently, after Kosovo Albanian police went in when they were told not to, and created tensions on the ground. But nevertheless, it led to fighting. And even though it was NATO on the ground, these things do arise. So it would have to be a very strong force that I think, again, would satisfy not only Israel, that it could do the job of protecting Israel and providing Israel security. And I know the sensitivities in Israel that people would feel about outsourcing, your security to an outside body. So, it would need a lot of trust in that, and you'd need to be fairly secure. But it would also have to be a body that, don't forget, would also need to have the trust of, if not all the local Palestinians, a significant amount of them, that would mean that when it needs to take action against militant groups, it didn't stir up wider societal antagonism and a pushback. And again, this is what we saw in Kosovo, that at first NATO was welcomed as, the great heroes, the saviors of the Kosovo Albanians, but it didn't take very long before the Kosovo Albanians started to say, but we want our independence. And are these forces going to become an impediment to that? So again, you've got that time frame. So it's a complex series of factors that I think need to be borne in mind in this.
I see. So one more question is with regards to the antagonism that you've just mentioned. So how do people that used to fight each other came to a situation where they mostly no longer do that? So in terms of the social element, how is it possible? Is it even possible in Kosovo?
Well, I mean, essentially, as I said, you had Kosovo, which was very different from what we call Central Serbia, that it was ethnically very different, but it had a proportion of Serbs who had lived there and had lived there for a very long time. And there'd also been a bit of territorial redrawing under under Tito's Yugoslavia, hence the northern territories. And this is one of the arguments why people say, well, look, maybe, a sensible solution were this was gerrymandered to give Kosovo a bit more of a Serbian population. Maybe the better thing is to just sign it back to Serbia. But you do still have the Serbs who live in the south. And essentially what you've got is those two communities. So the Serbs in the north still very attached to Serbia and still see themselves as essentially living under Serbian control, Serbian authority, if not formally Serbian sovereignty. The communities in the south have been much more willing to integrate, but many would argue they've not really had much choice. They're separated from Serbia, the rest of Serbia. They're much smaller. And slowly, they're disappearing. I mean, young people don't have job opportunities. Kosovo has got enough of its own economic problems without these people growing up in these enclaves. So what we're seeing is that, young people of any talent are going off to study in Belgrade and just not coming home. A little bit different, I think, in the north, but certainly in those other areas. So there's a sense that naturally, slowly over time, the question of the Serbs in the south is being solved of its own accord. But not the Serbs in the north. And that remains the key issue that I think has to be dealt with. And this is where we have this debate about autonomy, the creation of an association of Serbian municipalities to deal with it, maybe, redrawing the borders, whatever it's going to be. But it's essentially focused on the Serbs in the north. So what you're seeing is a combination of passage of time and demographic changes on the ground are making, and also, as I say, I think the reality of knowing Serbia can't take it back by force. All right, you've got some people who say we'll play the long game, 100 years from now, we'll get it back and whatever. Yeah, all right, whatever. But it for most ordinary Serbs, it's just not the sort of issue. They'll say, look, Kosovo, you're Serbia, but privately, most will say, look, it's gone. And you've got a substantial population who will say, and for the best, frankly. But again, it's that grievance element that I think is so important in this. If it had been a properly negotiated process, that had been transitioned, that people had time to get their heads around it, I think we could have had a different outcome. But I think, it was all these factors. And I think that grievance element is so strong in this. And how that relates to what you're talking about in Israel with an independent Palestine formally recognized as such is obviously a conversation that, you know, needs to be had. But it's a familiar story in these, you know, and as I say, it's not all cases. You know, if you go to, you know, for those who know Britain, you go to Britain, you ask people in mainland Britain, what about Northern Ireland? Would you be upset with a united Ireland? Hell no. No. 90% don't care one jot for Northern Ireland. You know, tomorrow you could have Irish unification. I always laugh that, you know, I have people say to me as a Brit, you know, Northern Ireland, so it's going to trigger me. It's going to get me really upset. And it's like, yeah, fine. If the population of Northern Ireland want to unite with Ireland, absolutely. I'm happy with that. I've got no attachment to Northern Ireland. Let them. If that's the democratic wish of those people to do it. But, you know, many countries find it very difficult to do that. And again, I think because we don't have a cultural attachment to Northern Ireland, I don't think we have a real economic attachment to Northern Ireland. There might be the snowball effect, but, you know, I don't think it's terribly powerful. I think many people in England have even reconciled themselves to an independent Scotland and Wales, if I'm to be honest. And I say that as somebody with a Scottish surname, but a very English accent, who would be entitled to a Welsh passport if Wales did become independent, I have to add. So I'm a true Brit, but...
Right, and the Brexit now...
oh, no, don't know. We avoid Brexit. Seriously, right. There's some things that I don't want to talk about.
So let me take Professor Oren Iftachel's question. Oren, please.
Thank you, James. Very full tour de force of the case. Thank you very much. So much richness, so much knowledge. And I'm trying to draw out, I am political geographer, political scientist, and urban planner. So I'm trying to draw out some themes that maybe can be both theoretical and also comparative in a way. Kosovo is a secession. I mean, it's a very soft secession, isn't it? The fact that it was an autonomous region, you know, it was almost a state, almost a republic. So on that respect, to what degree is actually a secessionist conflict? The other thing is the issue of force and violence. I mean, what is your overall argument? I'm almost hearing that whatever speaks at the end is the power of being able to apply violence to the conflict. That is, NATO managed to change geopolitically what's happened there, where in other conflicts, you need in the absence of power, for example, in Cyprus, it's not resolved. In the other places, there was Bashir and compliance. But in places like Israel, Palestine, whether, you know, there needs to be an external power, otherwise it cannot be resolved with the two actors on the ground. And in Serbia, that seems to have been the game changer. This is my question, you know, theoretically, whether it was an external power. And the last thing is the issue of that you didn't spend much time with it, but the Declaration of Independence. To what extent that has a force? I mean, 90 countries recognized Kosovo, and 139 countries recognized Palestine. And obviously, it's day and night, the difference. So what is your take about the strategy, or let's say the Abu Mazen strategy of trying to get through declarations, through recognition, and bit by bit get the independence as an international kind of consensus? So 3 questions about trying to draw lessons from there to our case. Yeah.
Thank you very, very much. I mean, you know, and 3 incredibly important questions. And I think the first, you know, the point about soft secession, I mean, look, I agree. I think we can sort of accept that Kosovo had a special status. The trouble was, as I mentioned, I mean, you know, under conceptions of international law, the idea is that we took as given that territorial boundaries, first order territorial boundaries within countries that are breaking apart, would then become the boundaries of the new states. And that was applied in Yugoslavia, it was applied in the Soviet Union. So we didn't push it down to second order. And technically, it was the Badinter Commission, which the EU put together to examine the legality of the claims of surrounding the breakup of Yugoslavia, essentially came up with the conclusion at the time that only the top level 6 republics had the rights of independence. So even though Kosovo was effectively a republic, officially it was an autonomous province of Serbia. And so, like, for example, Nagorno-Karabakh, which was an autonomous oblast inhabited predominantly by Armenians, but within Azerbaijan, it had to accept that it just remained within Azerbaijan. And so that was the position. But I agree. I mean, I think with the benefit of hindsight, Serbia would have been a lot better off just simply saying at the time, look, Yugoslavia is in the process of breaking up. We're not happy to lose Kosovo, but we can accept that essentially it was in all but name a 7th republic, and let's just let it go and negotiate, see if we can negotiate a good deal. But hell, if you had Serbia in that position to talk in that phase about Kosovo at that time, it would have talked that way about Croatia, it would have talked that way about Bosnia, and we wouldn't have had wars in former Yugoslavia.
Kosovo was much later. It was about 5-6 years later.
Yes, it was. But what
they
I'm
had
saying
wanted
is
independence for years.
If Serbia had gone into the whole breakup of Yugoslavia, but essentially Serbia's position was to say that it had a particular, interestingly enough, it had a very interesting contradictory conceptualization of self-determination, because Serbia argued it was the nations, not the republics, that had the right of self-determination, until it came to others taking a chunk out of Serbia, if you see what I mean. And then it suddenly said, oh no, the sanctity of the Serbian borders has got to be, whereas if it had gone in and just said, listen, you know what, we're in an unusual position because most Croats just live in Croatia, most Slovenes just live in Slovenia, most Montenegrin, well, actually lots of Montenegrins live in Serbia, but that's a complex relationship. Most Macedonians live in Macedonia, forgive it, any Greeks who will start, but that was what it was called at the time. And just accepted that, then, we would have been staring at a very different, all of Yugoslavia would have been in the EU today. It was much more advanced than many of the others. So I think, I can see your argument for soft secession. I actually have a certain degree of sympathy. Serbia, with the benefit of hindsight, should have just gone down that path. But from a strictly legal point of view, it was still secession. It was still considered a second-order republic, whether it should have been or not, but it was. And then later, it was, right, okay, we're in this situation. We've got a mess. We've got to find a way out of it. We'll call it a sui generis case. And Serbia has argued, well, that's just unfair. And you're seeing the resentment now because the Serbs are watching what's happening in Ukraine. They watch what happened in Nagorno-Karabakh. They say, why is it that Azerbaijanis can march in there and commit ethnic cleansing and force out all those rebellion Armenians? But when we did the same, we had that territory taken from us. So all this, what we're seeing at the moment is in many ways more difficult to deal with the Serbs. So I know it's sort of, but I think it's sort of, I just quickly on the other two, the power to apply violence, I think this is the theme that comes out, doesn't it? You're not going to be able to do this unless you're going to have something that can, an entity that can go in there and can provide the security on the ground for all parties. And it can't be, I think we can take it as given, it can't be Israel that can oversee this. If you want to do a state building exercise leading to a 2-state, a 3-state, as some are suggesting, solution, or whatever it's going to be, it's going to have to be a force that actually has some teeth and some respect from all sides, but can also be seen as an honest broker by all sides. And it's going to be a difficult ask. I fully accept that. It's not easy at all. And then the final one was just on the Declaration of Independence. Look, we could go. It's a huge debate, and for the lawyers in the audience who know the difference between declarative statehood versus constitutive statehood, this touches on. I'm the wrong person to ask. I'm an international relations person rather than an international law. I sort of straddle the two. But for a lawyer, by and large, it's declarative. If you meet the terms of statehood under Montevideo, you are a state, whether or not you're recognized. You know, it's independent of recognition. Whereas for an international relations person, it's in the title of what we do. It's international relations. It's about how entities interact with each other and their relations with each other. We tend to be constitutive. So very often recognition is absolutely vital. You can call yourself a state, but until you get large numbers of countries that recognize you, until you join the UN, that statehood is not really solidified and sort of, you know, beyond contestation. And even as we know in the case of Israel, even once you're in the UN, you can still have a degree of contestation.
All right. So just to say that under the Montevideo Agreement, it is about recognition. In any case, a state is when it is recognized by other states as a state. So recognition is a part of the legal definition, not only in international relations, but also under...
Oh, well, if you go to the Lauterpact reading of it, you're right. I mean, Lauterpact, who wrote the book on state recognition from 1947, was a rare international lawyer who was a constitutive theorist. It's a really interesting case that the most senior figure, but most others have actually been declarative, and they say it's independent of recognition. And of course, Montevideo is an interesting one because lawyers will always cite it, and international relations people will do it. But I did a book, and let me plug it, on state creation and secession with a fantastic colleague, Michaela Spabry. It's very cheap, paperback, Oxford University Press. Secession and state creation, what everyone needs to know. And the point that Mickey made in the book, which was absolutely excellent, is that everyone misreads what Montevideo was all about. It was actually about essentially saying this is what a state is to prevent US meddling in the rest of the Americas. So the United States was very clear on, right, okay, this entity is a state, we're not to get involved. So it was created for completely different reasons. It wasn't there to set out the terms of statehood because we needed a definition of statehood. It was set out to define the terms of statehood to solve a particular problem to do with sort of the Western Hemisphere. But anyway, that's a little side note. But yeah, you're right. There's two readings.
Yeah, all right. So we need to conclude for now. I still have many more questions to ask. I added here's a link for your book, your recent books that you just mentioned. I truly recommend it. And well, so I'm like in the feeling that it is interesting. There are many dissimilarities, but there are also lessons to learn. I'm not sure how this experience can play out now in this area, but I really appreciate the time and consideration you took for us tonight, and I appreciate it very much. And on behalf of everyone here, thank you very much, and good night.
Right. Thank you very much. And sorry if it was rather a long presentation, but there was quite a lot to cover. But hopefully it was some value.
It was great. So see you next week, next Tuesday, on our session on who would control Gaza. If you are not part of our WhatsApp group, please scan this QR and join us to get more details about the next events. Thank you, James. Good night.
Night there.